name is Jonathan Mercer, and the summer I turned 20. I accepted a position that, at the time, seemed like a perfect way to escape the noise of ordinary life. I had just graduated from college, unsure of what career path to follow, and needed both solitude and a paycheck. A seasonal job with the Forestry Service as a fire lookout felt like it had been designed for me personally. A simple post, a government check, and miles of wilderness in every direction. I imagined reading books in the quiet, sketching landscapes from the tower, maybe even writing something worth keeping. What I did not imagine was how isolation erodes perception, how silence amplifies the smallest sound until it seems like a voice, and how certain places hold histories that are better left undisturbed. I will tell you everything as plainly as I can, for these things happened to me, and though my mind has wrestled with doubt, I cannot deny the evidence of my senses. Training for the position was brief. They showed us a slideshow of fire behavior, instructed us on how to use the Osborne fire fender, a brass and wooden circular device bolted to the desk in the tower, used to measure bearings and distance to smoke, and reviewed the radio codes we would need. A handful of us were hired that summer, spread across different towers in the National Forest. I made small talk with the others, but the truth is I was already imagining myself alone, watching weather fronts roll over distant ridges, the air humming with possibility. Solitude felt romantic, a way to reset myself after years of crammed lecture halls and the endless chatter of peers. The tower assigned to me was called Garnet Peak Lookout. It was an aging, square frame structure raised on stilts above the treetops, accessible only by a narrow dirt road and a final half-mile hike. The service truck dropped me off with my duffel bag, a cooler, and a week's worth of supplies, promising a pack mule delivery for bulkier goods in a few days. The driver, a quiet man named Davis, gave me one last look before leaving. His eyes lingered as though he wanted to say something but swallowed the words. I told myself it was nothing. Inside, the tower was exactly what I had seen in photographs. A single room with windows on all four sides, a bed in one corner, a desk with the fire finder in the center, and shelves lined with notebooks, maps, and government forms. A small propane stove waited for me, as did a battered coffee pot. The walls were painted the greenish hue of bureaucracy, the kind of color that makes you feel both safe and trapped. I unpacked, swept dust from the floor, and settled in. For the first few days, everything matched my fantasy. The sunsets drenched the horizon in molten colors. The mornings were cool and crisp, dew steaming from the pine needles. At night, the stars were so sharp they felt like they could cut your skin. Yet even in those early days, before I admitted anything was wrong, I began noticing details that prickled the back of my neck. The logbooks left behind by previous lookouts were not filled with weather observations or fire reports, at least not exclusively. Some pages contained frantic scribbles, words pressed hard enough into the paper that they tore through. One entry read voices in the draw again. "Not coyotes." Another said, "If the mirror is turned, don't look." I told myself these were jokes, or perhaps the product of someone losing their mind to loneliness. Still, I felt uneasy enough that I closed the books and placed them back on the shelf, spine out, as though their contents could be contained by the mere act of tidiness. Communication with the ranger station was required twice daily, once at 9 in the morning, once at 6 in the evening. I would radio in, give the weather conditions, and confirm that no smoke was visible. The voice on the other end was usually Ranger Haskins, who sounded perpetually distracted. He never asked about me personally, only about the sky, the wind, and the ridgelines. That suited me fine. I preferred my solitude, or at least I thought I did. By the end of the first week, I had begun hearing something at night. It started subtly, like the rustling of branches far below the tower. I assumed it was deer moving through the underbrush, or perhaps black bears. But then the sounds changed. They became rhythmic, measured, almost like footsteps circling the base of the tower. Each night, the pattern repeated. A few hours after sunset, while I sat with a book or tried to sleep, the crunching would begin. Sometimes it sounded like pacing. Other times, like someone or something dragging a stick slowly along the support beams. I told myself it was the wind, but the rationalization never fit. The third night of this strange routine, I forced myself to look out the windows. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the clearing below. The trees swayed, shadows shifted, but I saw nothing human, nothing animal either. Still, the sound continued, as though the source was clever enough to remain always just out of view. My skin prickled. I wanted to radio the ranger station, but what would I say? That the night air was too noisy. I convinced myself to wait it out. The next morning, I descended the stairs to inspect the ground. Pine needles lay undisturbed, soil soft from recent rain, but no prints of any kind. No hoof marks, no paw prints, no boot impressions. I squatted, running my fingers through the dirt, hoping to find some trace. The silence mocked me. That day, when the pack mule delivery arrived, I asked the handler if wildlife ever circled the towers at night. He frowned, as though I had asked the wrong question. Best not to go looking for what you don't want to find, he muttered, tightening the straps on his pack. Before I could press him, he whistled to his mule and started back down the trail. The logbooks whispered in the back of my mind. If the mirror is turned, don't look. I had not seen any mirror in the tower, aside from a small shaving mirror in the bathroom nook. Yet the phrase lodged itself in my thoughts like a splinter. That night, I turned the mirror to face the wall before going to bed. I slept only fitfully, the footsteps circling once again, steady and patient. On the 10th day, I spotted smoke. A thin gray column rose beyond the eastern ridge. Adrenaline surged. Finally, I thought I could perform the job I had been hired for. I hurried to the firefinder, lined up the sighting apertures with the smoke, and called it in with the proper bearing. The ranger station thanked me, promised to send a crew, and instructed me to continue watching. I did. The smoke persisted for half an hour, then dissipated abruptly, like mist burned away by sunlight. I reported this too, but the radio crackled with only a curt acknowledgement. The following morning, Ranger Haskins asked why I had reported smoke when no fire crew had been able to locate the source. I insisted I had seen it clearly, that it was real. He sighed and told me to keep an eye out, but refrain from false alarms. His tone made my stomach twist. I began to wonder if the job was a test not of vigilance but of sanity. That night, the footsteps returned, louder, bolder. I sat rigid in the dark, every muscle tight, gripping the flashlight as if it were a weapon. The sound climbed the stairs. One creak, then another. I snapped on the light and shone it out the window, but the steps ceased instantly, leaving only silence so thick I could hear my own pulse. I did not sleep until dawn. The days blurred together after that. Hunger came and went, though I forced myself to eat canned beans and jerky. My eyes grew accustomed to scanning the horizon for fire, but more often I caught myself staring into the woods, searching for movement that never revealed itself. The logbooks beckoned, their spines crooked on the shelf. I resisted until one particularly bleak evening when I could no longer bear the loneliness. The entries grew stranger the further I read. One lookout had charted not smoke sightings but voices by direction. North voice, south voice, east voice, west voice. Another had drawn diagrams of the tower itself, with marks around the foundation as though mapping the path of something that circled endlessly. The most recent notebook ended mid-sentence. If it asks to be let in, do not. The page after was blank. Sleep abandoned me almost entirely. I began pacing the tower myself, tracing the narrow perimeter, eyes darting to the windows. My reflection in the glass startled me more than once. The gaunt face staring back seemed older, hollowed. The shaving mirror I had turned toward the wall. I caught myself checking it compulsively, just to confirm it had not been moved. Each time it remained exactly where I had left it, though I was never entirely reassured. One dawn, after a night of relentless circling noises, I decided to descend the tower armed with my flashlight and pocket knife. The ground was empty, pristine, yet carved into one of the support beams was a fresh mark, a crude spiral gouged deep into the wood. My breath caught. I knew with certainty it had not been there before. I touched it, half expecting the wood to be warm, but it was cold and rough. I reported nothing of this to the ranger station. What would I say? That a spiral had appeared overnight. That footsteps stalked me daily. My credibility had already been bruised by the vanished smoke. Instead, I carried the knowledge silently, my mind heavier with each passing day. The days stretched long, filled with paranoia. Sometimes I thought I saw movement in the distance. Not smoke, but figures slipping between trees, pale and quick. At night, the circling grew more insistent. Once, I woke to tapping on the glass itself. Soft, deliberate, like knuckles on a door. I froze in bed, afraid to breathe. The tapping repeated twice, then ceased. When daylight came, no mark remained on the windows. I began keeping my own logbook, separate from the official reports. In it I recorded every sound, every sighting, every unease. Writing was the only way to anchor myself. Yet I noticed, with a chill, that my handwriting sometimes shifted, cramped and slanted, unlike my usual style, as if another hand guided the pen. 2 weeks into the job, I dreamed of fire. In the dream, the forest burned with white flames that made no smoke, only shrieks that sounded like human voices. When I woke, the horizon glowed faintly, though the air was clear. I wondered if I had brought something back with me from the dream. By then, I no longer trusted the radio. Its static often carried whispers, faint and unintelligible, between transmissions. Once, I heard my own name hissed in the static, unmistakable, Jonathan. My stomach dropped, and I nearly hurled the radio out the window. Instead, I shut it off, sitting in silence, but the silence was worse. The isolation that had once seemed romantic now pressed on me like a physical weight. The tower creaked in the wind, every sound amplified. I found myself counting the seconds between gusts, as though the numbers could protect me. At times, I swore the tower swayed, though I knew it was anchored solidly to bedrock. I am not sure when the line between reality and imagination blurred, but I can tell you this: one night, I heard the footsteps stop at the very top of the stairs. The doorknob rattled. Not violently, not like an animal, like someone testing it gently, patiently. I sat frozen, my breath shallow. The knob turned a fraction, then stilled. After that, the silence was absolute. I did not open the door until morning. Nothing waited outside, nothing visible. But in the dirt at the base of the stairs, I finally found prints, not boots, not paws, not hooves. They were elongated, too narrow, like impressions left by hands pressed into the soil, fingers spread wide. They led away from the tower and vanished into the undergrowth. I stopped reporting anything but the weather after that. My official radio logs remained bland, factual. Clear skies, no smoke, wind steady from the northwest. But in my private notebook, the pages filled with darker truths, spirals drawn over and over, crude sketches of long hands reaching upward. I could not stop myself. The act of drawing felt compelled, inevitable. And so the summer that I had once imagined as a retreat into quiet became something else entirely. A slow unraveling, a test of whether the mind can survive when pressed by forces unseen yet undeniable. This is only the beginning, and the worst of it was still to come. Days and nights lost their edges after I found those prints in the dirt. The forest seemed to hold its breath whenever I stepped outside, as though every pine and fir leaned inward. Listening, I kept scanning the ground, hoping to find more tracks that might explain the phenomenon rationally, but the earth revealed nothing beyond that single set of elongated impressions. No scat, no fur, no claw marks. Only the faint outline of fingers pressed impossibly deep, vanishing into the woods like a signature written in a language I wasn't meant to understand. I tried to keep to routine. Each morning I made coffee on the propane stove, forcing myself to read the weather instruments and radio in my report. Clear skies, 20% humidity, no smoke visible. The words tasted like lies in my mouth, as if by saying them I erased the evidence of the night before. The ranger station never asked questions beyond the basics. Haskins' voice remained clipped, impatient, like he was always eager to end the call. That suited me. The less I had to speak, the better. But silence grew heavier with each passing day. I found myself talking aloud just to hear human tones, reading passages of books in a deliberate voice to break the stillness. Sometimes, in the middle of a sentence, I swore I heard another voice echo mine, soft and delayed, like the tower walls themselves were repeating me. Once I read the line, "All is well here in the wilderness," and I heard, carried on no wind, a perfect whisper. All is well. My mouth went dry, and I slammed the book shut. Sleep became impossible. I tried keeping the lantern lit at night, hoping the glow would ward off whatever circled outside. But even with light flooding the tower, the sounds persisted. The steps crunched, the dragging scratched, the taps brushed against the glass. I taped the little shaving mirror face down to the shelf, afraid of seeing something over my shoulder that didn't belong. Yet even hidden, it pulled at my awareness, as though daring me to check if it had shifted. The worst moments came in the liminal hours, just before dawn, when the forest was darkest, and just before dusk, when the shadows grew long and doubled. One morning, eerie-eyed, I thought I saw a figure leaning against a pine in the clearing below. It was too far to discern detail, just a tall, pale shape. I raised my binoculars, but the glass fogged instantly, obscuring my view. When I wiped them clean, the figure was gone. Food supplies dwindled faster than expected. Perhaps it was stress eating, or perhaps I had miscalculated. Either way, I grew lean, my belt looser around my waist. I began stretching my meals, counting beans in the tin like coins. The Forest Service had promised another mule delivery, but none came. Days passed. Each evening when I radioed in, I considered demanding more food, but fear of sounding hysterical kept me restrained. I wanted them to believe I was reliable. I wanted them to believe I wasn't unraveling. On the 17th night, I woke to the distinct sound of the door handle turning. Not rattling this time, turning. The old brass knob squeaked in its housing, as though gripped firmly. My body locked in place. I stared at the outline of the door, lit faintly by moonlight through the windows. The handle rotated slowly, deliberately, halfway down. Then it held down, suspended. My breath came shallow, heart slamming against my ribs. After what felt like an hour, but was likely only seconds, the handle released, easing back to neutral. I lay awake until the sky brightened, eyes glued to the door. In the morning, I found scratches around the lock, shallow grooves like something had pressed repeatedly against the metal. Not claws, not a tool, something narrow, tapered, like fingernails. I no longer trusted the tower to keep me safe. I carried the hatchet, meant for chopping firewood, everywhere inside. My journal entries became frantic, page after page filled with half-finished sentences and spirals drawn unconsciously in the margins. Sometimes I would look down and find my hand already sketching the pattern, before I realized what I was doing. The spiral widened, turning inward. pulling the eye deeper until the center blurred. I tore out pages and burned them on the stove, but even the smoke curled into spirals as it rose, as if mocking me. Around this time, I began hearing music. Faint, lilting notes drifting through the trees, like someone playing a flute at a distance. The sound came mostly at dusk, carried on no wind, threading between the trunks. It was not a melody I recognized, a tonal, uneven, as though composed by someone who knew the mechanics of music, but not the soul of it. I tried covering my ears, but the tune seemed to seep into bone, bypassing the eardrum entirely. When it faded, the silence felt worse. The following day, desperate for contact, I broke protocol and radioed the station at noon. "This is Garnet Peak Lookout," Mercer reporting, I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to steady it. "Can you confirm the next supply run?" "I'm running short," static hissed back, followed by Haskins' board replied, "Copy Garnet. Delivery scheduled soon. No exact date. Stand by." I pressed him. "I need to know when. Supplies are low." There was a long pause. Then he said flatly, "You'll have enough." The transmission cut off. The phrasing unsettled me. Not, "We'll get you enough." Not, "Supplies will arrive." Simply, "You'll have enough." As though the forest itself had already accounted for my survival. That night, the music came closer. I stepped to the window, lantern dimmed, and saw movement below. Figures slipped between trees, pale against the dark trunks. They did not move like animals. Their limbs were too long, their gait too smooth, gliding rather than walking. Each carried something that glinted faintly, catching moonlight like polished bone. I gripped the hatchet until my knuckles ached, forcing myself to stay hidden in shadow. The figures did not approach the tower, but circled the clearing, the flute like notes swelling as they moved. After an hour, they melted back into the forest. The next morning, I found more spirals carved into the support beams. Perfectly symmetrical this time, not the crude gouges I had first seen. Each was about the size of my palm, etched deep into the wood. I counted 12 in total, evenly spaced, as though forming a boundary around the tower. My stomach twisted when I realized they matched the diagrams I had seen in the old logbooks. By the 20th day, I was half mad with exhaustion. I caught my reflection in the window glass and recoiled at the hollowed eyes, the cracked lips. My skin looked too pale, my hair matted. Worse, I thought I saw something else layered over my reflection, a faint outline of another face, featureless and smooth, like wax stretched over bone. When I blinked, it was gone. I began to dread nightfall with a child's terror. I stuffed rags against the cracks in the door, piled furniture against it, though I knew such measures would be useless if something truly wanted entry. Still, the ritual soothed me, gave me the illusion of control. Each night the footsteps circled. The flute wailed, the tapping persisted. Sometimes, beneath the music, I swore I heard my own name woven into the notes. Then came the whisper, clearer than anything before, unmistakable, as though someone stood directly beside my bed. "Jonathan, let me in." My heart lurched. I turned slowly, but the room was empty, shadows stretching harmlessly. The whisper came again, closer, directly in my ear. "Jonathan." I leapt up, hatchet raised, swinging wildly at the air. The blade clanged against the window frame, sending a jolt up my arm. Nothing stood there. Yet the whisper lingered in memory, as vivid as any human voice. The next day, I considered abandoning the post. Hiking out meant miles of wilderness, but at least it would be movement, escape. Yet something inside me recoiled from the thought. The forest seemed to lean closer, as though waiting for me to try. I remembered the mule handler's words, "Best not to go looking for what you don't want to find." My instincts screamed that the woods would not let me leave so easily. The tower, for all its horrors, might be the only place keeping me tethered. I forced myself to hold the radio during evening check, in ready to confess everything, to demand extraction. But when Haskins answered, his voice sounded wrong. Hollow, distorted, as though spoken through layers of water. "Report," he said. My throat tightened. "No smoke, skies clear," I replied mechanically. There was a pause, then the faintest echo. Clear skies, no smoke. But it wasn't Haskins repeating me. The voice was higher, distant, carrying the same unnatural cadence I'd heard in the flute music. I dropped the radio. That night, something climbed the stairs again, slow, deliberate. I crouched in the corner, hatchet raised, pulse hammering. The knob rattled, then stilled. A voice spoke, muffled through the door, calm and measured. "Jonathan, enough watching. Open the door." My mouth went dry. I wanted to scream that I would not, but fear locked my jaw. Silence followed. Minutes passed. Then, a sound like fingernails dragging down the wood, leaving trails too deep to be human. By morning, the outer door was scarred with grooves running its full length. I sat on the floor shaking, staring at the marks. I wanted desperately to believe this was madness, that isolation had fractured me, but my eyes and fingers confirmed otherwise. The wood had been carved. The tower was under siege. I began rationing coffee, saving it for the hours before dawn when my willpower waned most. The bitter taste anchored me, kept me awake. Still, exhaustion pressed like a weight. Once, I nodded off at the desk and woke to find my notebook open, a new spiral drawn across 2 pages in heavy strokes. The pen still lay in my hand. I had no memory of writing it. On the 22nd night I broke. The whisper returned, softer, coaxing. Just a glance. Just once. Against every instinct, I untaped the small mirror from the shelf. My reflection swam before me, gaunt and hollow. Then the glass shimmered. Behind my image, another figure appeared, taller, faceless. Its hand resting on my shoulder, though nothing touched me. I screamed, flinging the mirror across the room. It shattered against the wall, shards scattering. From outside, the flute music rose in triumph. The tower felt poisoned after that, its walls thinner, its safety compromised. I swept the mirror fragments into a tin and sealed it, afraid the shards might still hold that image. But every reflective surface betrayed me after. Window glass, even the sheen of coffee in my mug. Always, faintly, the faceless outline hovered near. Food nearly gone, sanity unraveling, I faced a choice: remain and risk whatever waited to breach the tower, or descend into the forest where figures glided and music played. Neither path promised survival. Yet as I sit here writing this, I sense the decision may already be made for me. For the whispers are louder now, the spirals etch deeper, and something tells me the tower was never meant to protect at all. It was meant to contain. Morning began as a film laid over a nightmare, thin, grainy, colorless. The tower smelled faintly of cold metal and stale coffee, and the ghost of propane. I swept the floor as if tidying could evict whatever I'd invited by peeling the tape from that little mirror. The shards sat sealed in the tin, a dull rattle whenever moved it, like teeth in a box. I set the tin on the shelf beside the logbooks and placed a map over it, as though paper could smother reflection. When my hand left the lid, I felt the tiniest drag, like the tin wanted to stay attached to my palm, like it had weight out of proportion to its size. I ignored that feeling because there were only 2 options now. Either I had let something in, or I had simply let it closer, and pretending those were different felt necessary to get through the hour. I told myself I would do something practical, scientific, whatever that still meant. So I made a plan. The plan had steps. Step 1, go outside in daylight. Step 2, walk a measured bearing due east to the saddle between Garnet Peak and the next ridge, the same direction I had once seen smoke. Step 3, leave bright strips of orange flagging tape at intervals so I could find my way back. Step 4, Stay out no longer than 90 minutes before returning, no matter what. That last rule, I repeated aloud. No matter what. I said it in the same tone I used to recite phone numbers, as if memorizing could make it true. I strapped the hatchet to my belt, stuffed water and jerky in my pack, and took the good compass from the desk. The circle of spirals carved around the tower looked different in full sun. Neater, more deliberate, each groove catching light like inlaid metal. I knelt to trace one and felt the oddest sensation, as if my fingertip dipped into a current running the wrong way, pulling in rather than flowing out. It made my nail ache. I withdrew, stood, and forced myself down the stairs. The forest accepted me without ceremony. The fragrance of hot pine resin and dust rose as I walked. The ground was springy where needles layered thick, and I was briefly, absurdly grateful to feel the ordinary discomfort of a twig pricking through my boot. I set the compass to 90 degrees and went. Every 10 yards I tied a strip of flagging tape to a branch eye. Level, making sure the ribbon fluttered free, bright as a wound. The first 100 yards, I heard only insects and one distant woodpecker. I could almost believe that the nightlife of the tower did not exist beyond the clearing, that the world kept ordinary hours. 200 yards in, the air changed. It cooled without shade, like stepping under a cloud not visible in the sky. The insects went quiet, as if someone had drawn a curtain over a stage. My boot met a patch of soil that yielded too easily, like packed flour. When I looked down, I saw a dim oval pressed into the earth. The suggestion of fingers splayed wide, already softening at the edges as if the ground tried to forget it. I stepped around it, careful not to disturb the print, then kept moving. Tape, pace, compass, breath. I counted in groups of 30 to keep my attention anchored. On the fourth group, the flute began. It wasn't loud. It never was, not at first. The melody came from nowhere and everywhere. A thin reed of sound threaded through the trees. In daylight it felt more wrong, the same as seeing frost on a summer leaf. The notes didn't line up with any pattern a body could play. There were breaths where breath shouldn't be. Rests placed not between phrases but inside them, like the idea of stopping had been misunderstood. I paused, made myself write the time in my notebook, 10:01 a.m., and the bearing, still 90 degrees. I wrote, too, that I did not feel watched. That was a lie I wanted to come true, so I wrote it neat. At the saddle the wind moved, and with it a smell, not smoke, not rot. Something mineral and metallic, like a penny on the tongue. A dozen low stumps ringed the clearing, each cut clean decades ago, the wood silvered and split. Some had small, bone, white objects set on them, arranged with careful spacing. At first I thought they were lengths of antler. Up close I saw they were pipes, flutes of some kind, carved from hollowed bone. Holes drilled along their length were plugged with wads of resin, worked over many times by fingers that did not quite understand round. The faint music seemed to come from these pipes, though no wind moved through. I touched one and it was cold, colder than the air, as if the bone remembered winter. I circled the clearing counterclockwise once, then clockwise, then set my hand on my compass and checked. Still east. Still sane. On the far side, beyond the last stump, the ground fell away into a shallow depression lined with big, flat stones. A ring. The stones were darkened as if licked by heat, but when I reached to feel them, they were cool to the touch. The center of the ring was bare earth, tamped flat, smooth as a palm. At its center, a spiral had been pressed into the dust, the lines so straight, and even they looked drawn with a compass. The spiral turned inward and inward, and I felt that wrong direction current tugging at my eyes. I looked away, hard enough to make my neck hurt. In that look away, my gaze snagged on metal. A plaque half buried in the duff leaned against a stone. I brushed it clean, Letters emerged stamped into tarnished brass: governmentscarystories CCC 1936. Two more words had been scratched in crudely by hand at some later date. Duo. No object of the verb followed, just duo nout, and a long gouge, as if the writer had been shoved mid-sentence. I lifted the plaque and discovered beneath it a rusted metal lid the size of a dinner plate, bolted to bedrot. A hinge let it tilt, though corrosion had sealed it closed. I didn't try to force it. My fingers pulsed without pain, a phantom heartbeat in the tips, as if the rocks themselves had a circulation. I don't know how long I stood debating the wisdom of opening a thing someone once warned in brass not to open. I did not open it. I told myself that counted as rationality, and rationality meant safety, and safety meant survival at least until noon. I took one photograph in my mind: the ring, the spiral, the plaque, and then I marked the place on my map with a small X. I did not show the paper the respect of explaining. To my left, at the clearing's edge, hung something from a branch. A length of jute twine, frayed to brown hairs, held a small mirror no larger than a playing card. It was tied so it faced the ring. Sap had misted one corner, and trapped in the sap was a fly with its legs still extended, as if mid-flight. The mirror reflected a sliver of sky and the torn edge of a cloud. Even from an angle I could see the glass flecks, a trick of refraction or my nerves. The logbook entry came back, hard and cold: if the mirror is turned, don't look. I left it as it hung. My hands wanted to touch it with the force of an itch, and I did not scratch. 90 minutes comes quicker than you think when you keep promising yourself you'll leave in 10 more. I checked my watch. 86 minutes gone. I tied one last ribbon, a shout of orange in the green, and turned to follow my marks home. The first strip of tape fluttered in the same wind as my breath, and never looked so kind. I went from ribbon to ribbon, with the neat relief of a child reciting the alphabet in order. Somewhere between the 7th and 8th ribbon, distance went wrong. I could see the flutter of tape ahead, bright and crisp. Not far, only 30 yards, but the number of steps between me and it didn't change. I walked 30, 40, 60, counting with my breath, and the tape stayed 30 yards away, waving like a hand that did not mean hello. I laughed, a noise too loud in the quiet, and broke into a jog on principle. The tape approached, then saddled sideways the last 2 steps, and I was where I started. I tried another route, off my bearing a little, cutting a diagonal that would bring me to the same tree from a different angle. The air thickened like I'd stepped into shallow water. The needles underfoot resisted, gripping my soles. The flute music returned, distant but no longer atonal. No longer music either, just breath moving through a narrow aperture, in, out, around. I stopped without meaning to stop. My chest tightened. A long time later I realized I had held my breath to avoid breathing in time with it. I made myself kneel. I made myself dig a small hole with my knife and bury a coin, a token, a thing I could check later. When the hole was refilled, the ground looked untouched. There was no trace of the coin. I would have dug again, but my watch ticked, and my rule said 90 minutes. And when you are losing to a game that does not explain its rules, you do not cheat on your own. The 8th ribbon greeted me at last, not above me now but to my right. I did not argue with that change. I followed the tape to the 7th, to the 6th, to the 5th, counting backward like an antidote. The forest relaxed around step 4. The insects resumed their ordinary industry, their hum like wires strung between trees. A breeze rolled a sweet smell down from the ridge. A stand of fur warmed to resin. The 4th ribbon sighed. The 3rd fluttered. I touched the 2nd for luck, and then I saw the 1st, and through it, far off beyond the clearing, the tower. Seeing it did something complicated in me, like anger and relief shook hands and called a truce they did not intend to honor. The legs of the tower looked more like bones in daylight. Long, pale, jointed, anchored in concrete. The little square house at the top blinked with window glare. The rope I'd left coiled by the stairs was no longer a rope, but 3 neat loops, as if someone had practiced tying before doing the real thing. I hated the way that made me feel known. The clearing around the base was unchanged except where it was not. A fresh spiral had been carved into the dirt at the foot of the stairs, shallow but precise, like a signature. I walked around it rather than step across, as if the line might catch my boot like a tripwire. On the lowest riser sat a small object. I thought it was a pine cone until I was close enough to see the tool marks. It was a flute, no longer than my hand, whittled from bone so thin I could see light in the grain. Its mouth was stained pink, as if someone had pressed lips to it too hard. I did not touch it. I stood there in the heat, sweat cooling, eyes stinging from sun, and tried to do arithmetic how long I had been gone, how long it would take for something with long hands to shape bone. On the top landing the door waited, not scarred today, not scrawled, only there. I unlocked it, then paused with my palm on the wood. For the first time since arriving on Garnet Peak, I said aloud, to whatever would hear, "You cannot come in." The statement sounded absurd, like telling weather to stop. But I had to partition the world into what I permitted and what I didn't, even if the partition was drawn in chalk. Inside, the air was a little cooler. I set the compass on the desk, took the tin of mirror shards down, and held it to my ear like a seashell. No sound, only the faint tick of my pulse when the metal touched bone. I put it back. I drank water that had turned blood warm. At 9 o'clock the radio check came, the crackle like someone wadding dry leaves beside my head. Garnet report. Haskins board. Clear skies, no smoke, I said. My mouth added, "Wind light from the west," because that was true and facts still mattered. The response was delayed by a breath. Then another voice copied it, quieter, further away. A child repeating an adult. Clear skies, no smoke. Wind light from the west. The radio clicked dead. I turned the volume knob until the needle shook, and it remained dead. I ate 3 crackers and a strip of jerky, and told myself it was enough for now. My plan had a step 5 not written down make sense. So I took out the old logbooks. I opened one not to where a ribbon once marked, but where the paper wanted to fall. The entry was dated 1978. The handwriting was tall, elegant, the lines straight as fence posts. New moon last night. Woke to tapping as usual. Considered staying quiet, considered answering. Did neither. Morning fresh ash at the base. No source of flame, no scent of smoke. Drew the circle deeper and replaced the mirror. The next page contained a diagram of the tower supports, each leg labeled with a little crosshatch where a spiral should be cut. A note at the bottom read, "Not decoration. Not art. Not mine either. We're only caretakers." The following page had a sentence that tightened every muscle in my back. "If one mark is broken, they can place a voice inside your mouth." I went to the window and checked the support legs from above. 8 spirals on 8 posts, evenly spaced like teeth. I counted them twice. The old log's diagram showed 10. My tower had 8. I didn't know if I wanted to find 2 more or to learn they had never been there. I closed the book carefully so as not to tear the paper. Afternoon dulled into a burnt gold. Heat thunderheads climbed the horizon, and then thought better of it and flattened. The flute did not sound, and the silence had the tense quality of a held breath rather than peace. I occupied myself with the job. Glass check, horizon scan, draw bearings to the white scars where old fires had licked and stuttered out decades ago. Once, on the far ridge, heat shimmer coalesced into a column of pale, moving light like smoke reversed, pulling downward instead of rising. Report if you must, I told myself. But don't apologize for what you see. I called it in. Garnet to base, possible smoke east, by southeast, faint. Static swallowed what might have been a response. I kept watching. The column narrowed and blinked out like a candle snuffed with wet fingers. I had decided I would not spend a third night pretending I had any control over the door. Pretend is a muscle. You can only use it so long before it shakes. Instead, I would throw myself at the one piece of the puzzle that felt like a thing a pair of hands could alter. The spirals kept something outside, or in. The logbook advised caretaking. So I uncoiled the rope, tied it around my waist and a anchor bolt in the floor, and lowered myself under the tower with the hatchet and a carpenter's pencil. The crawl space wasn't much of a crawl. The stilts left 6 feet beneath the house, airy, criss-crossed with bracing. Dust motes curved through slats of light like fish. The air carried that mineral taste again, pennies and wet stone. Up close, the carved spirals were precise, almost machine-cut. Each groove was the same width, the same depth, the same pitch as it turned. Like someone had once held a template against the wood. On the western leg, halfway around the spiral, a little notch interrupted the cut. Just a slip, nothing structural. The kind of blemish you'd ignore on furniture. But the wood at that notch was stained darker, not sap, something else sucked in by grain. The hair prickled on my arms. I pressed the pencil into the notch and shaded it, making the line continuous, not out of faith, but in the way you close a cracked window before a storm on the chance it matters. On the northern leg, a different flaw ran across the spiral at a shallow angle, as if someone had scored the wood later with a knife. I scraped the groove clean with the back of the hatchet and blew the dust out. It smelled like nothing living. I redrew the curve where it had been cut, the pencil leaving a dull black line in the pale wood. The entire time, I had the sense of being observed closely by someone trying very hard not to breathe. The urge to look over my shoulder was reptile deep. I resisted because I am not a reptile, and sometimes that's the whole victory. I found one leg whose spiral had been hacked crudely with fresh white cuts, the kind a dull blade leaves when the hand guiding it does not understand grain. That had not been there yesterday. I know this like I know my own name. I traced the fresh gouges and felt the wood thirsting around them. Thirsty the way a mouth is when the tongue has been sandpaper for days. I pressed the flat of my palm over the damaged place and whispered, "No. Because you use what you have, whether or not it's the right tool." Then I followed the scribed line and cleaned it, and closed it and redrew it. By the time I finished, my pencil was half its length, and the light under the tower turned the color of a bruise. I backed out, rope burning a stripe across my shirt, and sat on the bottom stair with my lungs shaking like paper. The flute stayed gone. The silence didn't applaud. At 6 the radio check came, and I almost didn't answer. Then I did, because obedience is another muscle. "Garnet, report. Clear skies," I said. "No smoke." A new voice broke in, female, smooth as something practiced on a different tongue. "Jonathan," she said, and the syllables went through the plastic not as sound but as shape. I held the radio far away, as if distance could shrink phonemes. "Jonathan, we are ready now." I pressed transmit without meaning to, and the button clicked, and I heard myself say into a dead mic, "I am not." The same voice answered, unbothered. "Enough watching. Come down." The radio light went out. It stayed out no matter how I turned the knob. The tower felt taller by a floor. I made coffee I did not want and sipped it until the cup was empty. I opened my notebook and wrote, in a hand suddenly steady, "I will not open the door after sunset." I wrote it again. The repeated sentence looked like lines a child does at school for punishment. The last line slanted toward the corner of the page. I shut the book and listened. Sunset hid itself in the haze. The world did not darken so much as lose temperature, the way a face looks when the person steps away and leaves the expression behind. The clearing gathered the gray the way a saucer gathers spilled water. The first sound was not steps or flute or tapping. It was breathing, not mine. The tower walls picked up the breath and repeated it, a stethoscope for the clearing. In out, in out. Something paced exactly the length of a man's stride beneath the knotted joists in a perfect square. It paused at each corner, as if respecting geometry. When it reached the base of the stairs, it exhaled a sound that was not a word but held the posture of one. The doorknob turned. The handle depressed halfway and held. That was where it always paused. The voice that spoke then was not a whisper, but not loud either. It was the volume you use to speak to someone beside you at a funeral. Jonathan had said. You can hand me the tin. I had not thought of anything knowing about the box. I did not rise. Jonathan, it said again, coaxing now, a lullaby tone air on a lip of bone. The glass is heavy for you. I can take it. I can keep it turned the right way. The wrongness of those words was a wire pulled taut through my spine. I said, and my voice cracked. The knob eased back. A long, soft scrape whispered down the door. The thing at the base of the stairs went away 3 steps and returned 4, went away 5 and returned 3, making a little math I could not solve. Somewhere beyond the edge of the clearing, the flute's melody tried to begin and failed, and tried again, and failed, as if the mouth that played had been taught not to blow but to inhale. The night measured itself by each time I did not move. That is not meaning, it is counting. I counted until numbers lost taste. Around what must have been midnight, a light appeared in the woods to the east, a pale column like inverted smoke. It drifted closer, weaving between trunks, folding and unfolding like a sleeve of silk. No footfalls accompanied it. When it reached the clearing's edge, it stopped. I understood, with a clarity that felt gifted rather than earned, that if I stepped into it, I would go somewhere I could not return from. The light tilted, an invitation. I went to the far window and gripped the sill and felt the building's bones grieve that my fingers had nothing to carve. At some hour later than midnight, the tapping returned, but different. It came from the floor, not the door. A delicate knock-knock, as if from a polite neighbor under the boards. Then the faintest hum, a breath moving through a pipe a room below me. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and pictured the crawl space beneath the house, dark as a throat. I pictured 9 spirals neat and true, and 1 spiral cut wrong. I pictured a lid of metal bolted to bedrock, and brass letters telling me "Dio Naut." I pictured a little mirror tied to a branch pointing inward instead of out, and a ring of stones holding cold like a secret. When dawn found me, it did so in pieces, in pale panes across the floor, like paper laid over a model. I stood, joints popping, and went to the door. The handle had been turned in the night and left that way, pointing at 5 o'clock. The wood held a new mark, a section of the spiral pattern I had redrawn beneath, copied here in shallow scratches, incomplete, wrong. I pressed my thumb to the glass of the north window and left a print. It was comforting to see evidence. I existed in ordinary ways. There was a shape at the foot of the stairs. For a foolish, waking second, I thought it was the mule delivery at last, some bag of flour or carton of eggs. It was a bag, yes, but made of burlap, tied with twine gif. The knot was complicated, a fisherman's to a student's eye. I took the hatchet and cut the tie from the landing, and then I did not descend. I hauled the bag up like a fisherman unwilling to enter the water. Inside food, cans of beans and peaches, crackers in wax paper, coffee in an old tin. No note, unless you count the thing at the bottom. A sliver of mirror. I did not touch it. I carried the whole bag to the far corner and set it down with the care you give a sleeping animal. I ate a peach like I had not earned it, juice down my wrist, pulp sugaring the air. The sweetness hurt. I wanted to weep and did not, because weeping would salt me, and I did not want to be salt. When the radio check came, right on 9, the voice on the other end was Davis, the driver. "Morning, Mercer," he said, and cheer lived in his words like a borrowed shirt. "How's our sentinel?" I fumbled for ease. "Still here," I said. "Foot arrived." "Thanks. We'd take care of our own," he said, then added, "We'll collect the tin on Thursday." A pause. "You can just set it on the top stair. Don't trouble yourself." I went cold in a way that had nothing to do with air. "What tin?" I asked, though the two of us knew which. "The mirror tin," he said, gentle, coaxing, like a man asking for a package he knows belongs to him. "That's ours." The radio clicked. The line went dead without static. For a long time the tower was very quiet. If I could claim one moment as the hinge, it was not the first footstep, or the white flame, or the mirror in the sap. It was the hour I spent sitting at the desk with the tin in front of me, the lid under my palm, thinking about what kind of caretaker I was. The logbook had called it caretaking, not owning. Care meant not just tending the marks, but refusing to hand over the tools by which the place was kept closed. I lifted the tin, walked to the hatch in the floor, where the maintenance ladder led to the underside, and set the tin on the wood above the square of dark. I said aloud, "To the hatch, to the space beneath, to the wood that had learned the shape of my bare feet. This does not go out. Night will come again. It always does. I will redraw what they scrape. I will tape every reflective surface in this room until the place looks like I'm living inside a parcel. I will not turn any mirror hung in the trees. I will not open the door after sunset. If the breathing puts words in my mouth, I will grind my teeth until the words crack." This sounds brave and is not. It is only drawing smaller circles and hoping the center holds. But today, before the sun falls, I will go under the tower again. I will take the hatchet and the pencil and the rope. I will look for the 2 missing spirals in the old diagram, the ones that aren't on my legs. If I can't find them on the posts, I will look on the bedrock. If I can't find them there, I will look on the underside of the floorboards where the taps came from. If I find instead a metal lid bolted to the stone, with the CCC year rusting the hinge and the words "Dio Naut" still legible in grease and patience, I will not open it. I will not. But I will put my ear to it. If the sound underneath is the same flute that plays in the trees, I will know this is a circle and that what I am keeping out is what the men in 1936 kept in. If the sound underneath is my own breath, slowed and deep and patient, I will know it learned my cadence well enough to wear it. Either way, there is knowledge. Knowledge will not save anyone. It will only clear a corner of the glass. I stand now, set the notebook down, tie the rope around my waist. The hatchet hangs against my thigh. A small confidence. The light is good. The day is hot. I lift the hatch in the floor. The air that comes up tastes like coins in winter. I drop the rope through, then my legs, then myself, hand over hand, into the quiet under the house, where the wood smells like the inside of a cupboard and the earth smells like a locked drawer. My socks blacken on dust. The spirals wait. The bolt heads gleam on a circle of something buried. I crouch until my knees pop and place my ear to the metal. The cold climbs the bone of my skull. For 1 second there is only that cold and the small animal of my heart. For the next second the sound comes, faint, measured, as if someone very close and very far away is learning to breathe like me. The sound through the metal was my undoing. Not the pitch, not the tone, not even the rhythm. It was the familiarity. Each inhale, Each exhale matched mine with mathematical precision, as though my lungs had been rehearsed from below for weeks. I pressed harder, irrationally wanting to catch the faintest imperfection that would prove it wasn't me, but the synchronicity held, the mirror rhythm impossible. And then, without warning, the breath below me paused while mine continued. The misalignment yanked every nerve in my body tight, like a violin string tuned past breaking. I staggered back, cracking my head against a joist. The sound beneath did not resume. The silence afterward was worse than the mimicry. I climbed the rope clumsily, palms burning, and slammed the hatch shut. I locked it, though the lock was no more than a loop of steel and a pin. The tower felt taller, emptier, and for the first time I wished it had solid walls, instead of windows on every side. I pulled the curtains tight, but daylight seeped around them anyway, bleaching the air into a pale, sickly glow. My notebook lay open on the desk. I wrote only one sentence. It was waiting for me to notice the difference. I avoided the hatch for the rest of the day, though my ears seemed tuned to its presence, catching every groan of timber, every shift of dust below. I tried to read, but the words dissolved. I tried to eat, but food turned to paste in my mouth. At 6 o'clock the radio crackled with the expected call. Haskins this time. Garnett? Report. My voice shook. Clear skies. No smoke. Static hummed. Then came a second voice layered under his. Whisper, thin, heavy smoke, heavy smoke. I nearly dropped the handset. Repeat, I asked. Only Haskins answered, sounding bored. Copy, clear skies. He clicked off. That night, nothing touched the door. But I did not rest. I sat with the hatchet across my lap and the tin of mirror shards at my feet, as though proximity to the thing I most feared could somehow render me immune. Near midnight, the breathing returned, not beneath the floor this time, but behind the walls. The tower has no walls thick enough to conceal a body, but the sound came anyway, moving clockwise from window to window, as if something circled the outer deck, leaning against the boards, exhaling. My heart stuttered with each pass. By dawn I was shaking so hard my teeth clicked. The food bag still sat in the corner. I forced myself to inventory it in daylight. Beans, crackers, peaches, coffee, all real, all ordinary, except for the mirror shard tucked at the bottom. I held it up once, accidentally catching my own reflection. My face looked stretched, lips pale, eyes sunken. For a flicker, another face pressed close behind mine, smooth where features should be. I hurled the shard out the window. It landed in the clearing with a dull glint and lay there like bait. I refused to retrieve it. The next days bled together. I tried to rebuild routine, radioing in, logging weather, redrawing the spirals where fresh gouges appeared each morning. They always returned marred, as if something tested them each night, scratching wrong angles, erasing portions of the line. Caretaking felt like patching leaks in a dam with my hands. I began to suspect that the tower itself was less a place of observation and more a lock, its structure a seal on something ancient beneath. The thought carried a terrible plausibility, as though the job I'd taken had never been about fire at all. On the 29th day, I heard voices in daylight. They came faint at first, from the eastern ridge where the ring of stones lay. I fetched the binoculars, though my stomach turned. Through the glass I saw figures gathered around the depression, pale and tall, their movements wrong. Their shoulders hunched too high, their arms too long. They passed something between them, lifting it toward invisible mouths. The faint piping music rose again. Only this time I saw the source, bone flutes, lifted by featureless hands. Breath pulled through holes by lips that did not exist. The sight made my stomach lurch. I lowered the binoculars and swore never to raise them again. By evening, the figures were gone, but the ring of stones glowed faintly even from my tower. It pulsed like an ember, fading in and out, As though the ground itself exhaled light, I tried the radio. Only static answered. Thick, wet static like bubbling tar. I threw the handset down. At midnight, the door rattled violently for the first time. Not coaxing, not polite, furious. The knob jerked, the hinges groaned, and fists or hands or something like them pounded the wood in rapid succession. My barricade shuddered. I screamed hoarsely, pressing my back to the door, hatchet raised. Between the blows came words, shouted, overlapping, "Let us in. Let us in. Let us in." The chorus rose, dozens of voices speaking in unison, until suddenly it stopped. The silence left my ears ringing. I slid down against the wood and wept into my knees until dawn. When I finally stepped outside, the clearing was a ruin. The spirals had been obliterated, carved over with jagged crosses. The soil was churned like hooves had trampled it, though no tracks remained. In the center of the clearing lay the tin of mirror shards, lid pried open, glass scattered. None of it glinted in the sun. Each shard had dulled to a gray sheen, as if the reflections had been scraped clean. I wanted to run. Every cell in me screamed for flight, to abandon the tower and take my chances in the woods. But when I looked toward the trail, the trees seemed closer, their shadows denser. A figure stood between the trunks, still and pale, watching. Another appeared further left. Then another. They lined the path in silence, their featureless faces tilted. The forest was no escape. I retreated up the stairs and locked the door again, knowing locks were theater. That afternoon, a helicopter droned faintly overhead. My heart leapt. I ran onto the deck, waving my arms. The machine banked once, circled, then flew on without lowering. I screamed until my throat tore. No one looked down. When it was gone, the silence pressed harder. Triumphant, I tried to plan again, as I had on that second week. Plans had saved me before. But each option collapsed. Stay and the nightly siege would grow until wood gave way. Leave and the forest would close around me. Signal and only static would answer. My notes blurred into frantic scrawl. Pages filled with spirals I had no memory of drawing. I tore them out, burned them, only to find new spirals etched into the desk itself, shallow grooves under my fingernails. On the 31st night, I dreamed, or believed I dreamed, that the hatch under the floor opened by itself. Cold air rose, carrying the metallic tang. A pale hand emerged, fingers impossibly long, gripping the rung of the ladder. I woke screaming, only to find the hatch closed. But the metal lock was unfastened. The next day, the ranger station finally called first. "Garnet, report," Haskins said. His voice sounded different, warmer, almost kind. I clutched the handset. "I need extraction," I said. "Now, today." There was a pause. Then he replied, "Of course. Just bring the tin down to the base of the stairs. That's all we need. After that, you can leave." I stared at the empty corner where the tin had once sat. "It's gone," I whispered. Silence stretched. Then his voice returned, colder. "Then you're staying." The line cut. Something inside me fractured. I smashed the radio against the desk until it broke into fragments. Static still hissed from the speaker, even after the circuit board cracked. I hurled the pieces out the window. They landed in the dirt below, where pale shapes bent immediately to retrieve them, cradling each fragment as though precious. That night the tower shook, not metaphorically. It swayed as though enormous hands gripped its legs and rattled. Dust fell from the ceiling. My teeth clacked. I screamed into the void, begging for it to stop, swearing I would not open, swearing I would burn the place down. At once the shaking ceased. Outside, dozens of figures stood at the clearing's edge, silent, heads tilted. One stepped forward and raised a hand, palm outward, in mockery of a wave. I collapsed on the floor, shaking, eyes burning. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. Supplies are nearly gone again. The spiral marks wear down faster each day, as though resisting me. The hatch creaks at night. My own reflection has begun to betray me, lips moving when mine do not. When I sleep, I dream of standing in the ring of stones, the flutes pressed to my mouth, playing breath that is not mine. I wake gasping, my lungs aching as though I've spent hours blowing into bone. I am writing this now as dawn breaks on my 33rd day. The clearing is empty, but I know that means nothing. The spiral on the north leg is broken again, deeper than before, as if carved from within the wood. The hatch is rattling even as I set these words down. I cannot ignore it much longer. I hear my name rising from below, whispered in the same cadence as my own breath. If the next part of this account is written, it will mean I opened the hatch, or it will mean something else opened it for me, and still put a pen in my hand. Either way, the truth of this place will not stay sealed. The tower was never a job, it was a bargain, and bargains always come due. I told myself I would do 3 things before I opened the hatch. The first was small. Drink the last of the coffee and keep the cup close, because the ordinary weight of a mug matters when everything else is unmoored. The second was practical. Go around the tower and redraw every spiral until the graphite in my pencil stained my skin. The third was a promise. If a voice asked for the tin again, I would answer it by name, my name, and refuse without apology. I repeated this list like an oath, while dawn scissored narrow beams across the floorboards and the hatch breathed in time with me. The pencil bit deeper than it had yesterday. It felt like filling cracks in porcelain with a dull needle, useless and necessary at once. I lowered myself beneath the house on the rope and worked from leg to leg, tracing the curves until the lines were whole. I whispered numbers as I moved. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, an old trick from childhood to steady my hands. When I reached the western leg, my graphite met fresh, white wood where something had worried the spiral open again, and I pressed hard enough to snap the lead. The broken tip stuck in the cut like the point of a tiny spear. I left it there. I wanted the wood to choke on it. Back above, I stood over the hatch and felt the cold rise through the seam around it. The padlock lay beside the loop like a mouth missing a tooth. I tried to refasten it twice and failed. The hinge had bent, or my hands had forgotten the motion. I set the mug down, tucked the hatchet into my belt, and pulled the maintenance ladder up until the hatch lid was all that separated me from the room, where I had slept like a child the first 3 nights. Then I set my palm on the wood and said, "I'm coming down." I said it to myself as much as to what waited. Saying it made it a choice. The air below tasted like pennies, and water left in a coil of copper pipe. The ladder's rungs were cold enough to sting through my skin. When my feet touched the packed earth, the world above narrowed to a square of ceiling boards. Dust hung in the slats of light like lint trapped in a throat. The spirals cut into the legs glowed faintly where graphite darkened them, not with light, exactly, but with attention. You could feel where a line is unbroken, the same way you feel a seam under a fingertip with your eyes closed. The bolt heads on the round steel plate in the ground were the color of old coins. I knelt and pressed my ear to the metal. The breath below matched mine for 2 inhales, 2 exhales, and then paused. Mine didn't. That stagger between us made my stomach clench, as though I'd misstepped on stairs I couldn't see. "Enough," I said, though I didn't raise my voice. The metal gave back a whisper of its own, not echo, but the suggestion of words forming just beyond hearing. I lay my palm flat on the plate. It was slick with condensation, like touching an animal that had been in the river. The bolts were old, but not as set as I had imagined. One had been backed off a quarter turn at some point. You could tell by the shine of the threads. My fingers found the looseness by instinct. It would have taken only a wrench and a willingness to disobey brass to lift the lid. I put my hand on the loosened bolt and did nothing. There are kinds of courage that are only different flavors of impatience. I do not flatter myself that I am brave. I was tired enough to be careful. Something scuffed the dirt just beyond the footprint of the tower. Not steps, the whisper of fabric or bark brushing against cloth. Then the softest knock against the cross, bracing of the legs, as polite as a collar. The bone, flute breath that always came at dusk pulled through a hole in the world and tried to begin, failed, tried again. No. I said to the plate, to the breath below, to myself, no to all of you. My voice sounded absurdly formal in the crawl space, like a man refusing a loan in an empty bank. I climbed back to the room and shut the hatch, sliding the pin through the loop, setting the bent padlock where a lock would be for a person who believed in locks. The radio squawked at 9 with a sound like dry leaves crushed in a fist. I lifted the handset and did not give my report. I waited. Garnet, Haskins said after a beat, but the name creaked, the way an old floorboard says hello when you step on it in the dark. Another voice slid under his like a blade under paper. Jonathan, it said, patient as a metronome. Bring the tin down to the base of the stairs. I stood very still. There is no tin, I said, and my mouth tasted like aluminum. The knot, Haskins took a slow breath through a reed. Then bring yourself. No, I said, and this time the word came out stronger.
No.
The radio went dead. Nothing hissed. The silence was deliberate. I could have waited, repeated the caretaking I had been doing, redrawn spirals, taped over reflections until the room looked like a package, prayed that the old strengths would hold. But there is a profession of despair that looks like patience. The spirals were wearing faster than I could darken them. The hatch knew my name. The ring of stones on the saddle pulsed, sometimes at night like a heart under thin skin. And there was the mirror hung from the branch with the fly in resin, a small insistence facing inward. The logbook's line bloomed unhelpfully. If the mirror is turned, don't look. It did not say don't turn it. It said don't look. I packed. Not to leave, because the forest would not let me, but to move with intention. I wrapped my hand in a bandana and picked up the bone flute someone had left on the lowest stair 3 weeks ago, the one with the mouth stained pink. It was lighter than I expected. Almost nothing at all. The way a bird's bone is so empty, it seems more architecture than matter. The holes had been punched irregularly, almost right, as if whoever made it had copied from a drawing, not a hand. I brought water, jerky, the hatchet, the rope, and a strip of duct tape for the mirror, because I believed in tape the way you believe in a friend who won't tell you you're wrong, only look at you long enough that you say it yourself. The clearing at mid-morning felt abandoned. Insects worked. Heat flared off the dirt. The spiral someone had scratched on the door last night looked like a child's imitation of handwriting. I walked east, counting steps, tying flagging ribbon every dozen paces. Not because I thought the forest would respect the trail I made, but because I wanted to lay a line that said I tried. The saddle welcomed me with that same unseasonable cool. The chemical copper smell, the ring of stones still dark from light that had licked them and gone. The mirror on its string hung where it had hung yesterday and the day before. Fly lacquered and sat by one wing, legs splayed as if still reaching for air. I did not touch the glass. I took the tape and folded a tab at the end so I could find it later by feeble. Then, without looking, I slid the edge between my fingers and the back of the mirror and wrapped it once, twice, 3 times. The way you bind a bandage on a finger you've cut slicing an onion. I rotated the mirror carefully on its string so that whatever it had faced before it now faced the other way. I did it by the tug of weight on the cord, by the little change in balance when the knot rolled over. I kept my eyes on the fly in the sap, which was not a reflection and therefore a mercy. When the mirror had turned half a circle and then a half again, I gently pressed the folded tab down to fix the tape. I looked nowhere except the knotted string, and the fly that would never free itself, and the pale skin under my own knuckles. "There," I said to the empty grove, and I did not let myself look at what the mirror now showed. I stood at the edge of the stone ring and counted my breaths, slow. That 4-7-8 pattern you learn once when you can't sleep, and the internet tells you if you pretend to be calm long enough your body will do it for real. In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. On the 5th cycle I lifted the bone flute and set it to my lip. It stank faintly of old saliva and a mineral as precise as blood. The mouthpiece was wrong, cut at an angle that wanted someone to inhale through it instead of blow. That made a kind of broken sense. A device for pulling a breath out, not sending one in. I put my mouth on it anyway, stubborn as a bad idea, and exhaled. The first note was not a note at all, only air hitting the sharp rim of a hole and shredding. The second made a thin whistle, off-pitch, like wind slipping through winter window frames. The third time I adjusted my jaw and my tongue, and the angle of my breath, the way you adjust when you're learning to do anything your body pretends is simple, but is not. A sound came that wasn't music and wasn't not. It was the sound of a boundary being taught to hold. The ring of stones shivered like a skin under a cold hand. The spiral in the dust at the center tightened by one concentric scratch, as if a finger had drawn it inward while nothing bent. I kept blowing. I did not stop for the 7 count. I blew until my eyes watered and my head swam, and spots danced like ash on the air. The woods did not like that. The trees answered not with wind but with absence of it. The light around me cooled and sharpened. On the western shoulder of the saddle, figures gathered without approaching, pale, too long in the limb. Heads canted as if listening with a part of the skull no doctor would name. They were not many, but they were enough to suggest many more behind them, and many more behind those. They did not move while I played. When I ran out of breath, the bone wanted to pull the last of it from me. I took the flute from my mouth and gasped, and the sound went out of it like a candle extinguished between wet fingers. "Not yours?" I told the ring, the stones, the figures. The mirror I refused to see. "Not yours." The words were thin things to throw against a slope of dirt, but I threw them anyway, and then I did not wait to see if they stuck. I walked away the exact number of steps I had counted coming in. The first ribbon of orange, that was supposed to be 30 yards, stayed 30 yards, but this time the steps between us did change. The forest did not slide me sideways. The tape brushed my arm as I passed. I did not turn my head when something to my left matched my pace. I did not blink when the woods shared my breath for 3 inhales and then lost it on the 4th. I did not look back. If the mirror on the string had turned its little face to follow me, I would not know. I had decided to live by a smaller set of facts. Back at the tower, the clearing looked different in the way a face looks different after you learn a secret about the person's childhood. Still the same skin and bones, the same eyes, the same mouth, but you can't see them without also seeing the thing they didn't say. The door bore a new mark. Not a spiral this time, but a straight line carved slowly down the grain, as if someone had wanted to learn what a straight line felt like to a hand. On the lowest stair, the place where the little flute had been, someone had left a coin. Not minted, no face, no year. A round of metal stamped with a spiral on one side and a circle of 10 hatch marks on the other. I did not touch it. I would have flung it into the brush if I had been a man who could leave a point unanswered. Instead, I went inside. At 6, the radio called. Not Haskins, not Davis, a voice without gender that wore syllables like borrowed clothes. "Jonathan, It said, perfectly calm. We are ready now. I let the silence between us fill until the handset creaked in my palm. When I finally answered, my voice scraped from the part of me that still believed in rules. No. The mirror stays turned. The door stays shut. The voice did not imitate me. It did not plead. It did not threaten. It said, then breathe, and cut the line. Night lagged, as if the day had its foot on the hem of its coat. Heat thinned. The sky turned the fragile peach color of a bruise that's almost gone. I taped the windows, not to keep anything out, but to keep myself from looking. I set the mug on the hatch lid. I put the rope back on the maintenance ladder and looped the other end around my waist, a ritual of belonging to something that still held me up. I sat with the hatchet across my thighs and focused on counting mistakes I had not yet made. After full dark, the breathing began, not under the floor, not at the door, but in the corner of the room behind my left shoulder. A person standing there would have had their back to the north window. A person standing there would have left a shadow on the glass. There was no shadow. The breath matched me for 2 counts, and then seized the third for itself. I did not turn. A fingernail tapped the tin I no longer had. That was the first time the night mocked me like a child behind a couch that isn't big enough to hide him. Then the doorknob turned not halfway, not 3/4, but fully, and stopped against the latch with a damp click. The room smelled like pennies and pine pitch, and the inside of a paper bag humid, with a person's breath. The deck boards outside groaned, as if someone very light had shifted their weight from one foot to the other to see whether the sound was the same each time. The radio, broken and scattered in the dirt an afternoon ago, squawked from nowhere, printing a sentence in a voice I almost believed was mine. Clear skies. No smoke. Then why are you here? I asked, to the dark, to the breath, to the thing that wanted me to make the last mistake. This time there was an answer. Not words. A sound like a finger tracing the inside of a shell. The hatch under my soles vibrated with it, and the bolt I had found a quarter, turned loose, ticked, as if it were the second hand on a clock that had been buried and forgotten. I put my palm on the wood and felt cold climb the bones of my arm. I moved my mouth to say no, and what came out was yes, because the power to decide which syllable leaves you is a measure. I opened the hatch. It was not a dramatic motion. A square of wood rose. Cold climb. The dark below did not pour out, because dark is not a liquid. But it did something that my eyes interpreted as motion, even as they swore they could not see. The metal plate pulsed, not with light but with attention. The breath from beneath fixed on my face the way a dog will pick one person in a room to love or bite. Jonathan, the below said without sound and with all of it. Teach us. That was the wrong thing to ask. I do not know much. But I know that you do not teach something that learns faster than you and chews information like gristle and grows strong on it. I do not know much. But I know how to lie badly, and you can sometimes make a lie a bandage if you fold it enough times. I put my mouth to the hatch like a man sharing a secret across a pillow, and I breathed a rhythm that does not comfort the body. 5, 6, 5, 6, 7, 2, 7, 2, and I kept it for a long time. Long enough that my head ached and my hands shook, and I wanted to cough and sneezed and swallowed the sneeze. Because you do not interrupt a prayer, you pretend to believe in halfway through. The plate answered. It tried to keep the pattern and stumbled. It tried again and did not get better. It tried a third time with a weird determination that made me think of a child learning to tie a knot by muscle memory that was borrowed, not earned. Good, I said, because praise is a bruise that disappears slower than hurt, and I breathed wrong on purpose again. The thing beneath me did not like wrong. It knew the cadence of lungs, because it had been measuring mine for a month. It knew the length of my exhale and the hitch when I woke from a bad dream and the shape of the breath I took before saying, no. But it did not know the bad rhythm that does not relax a person. The one you use when you're 12 and you're trying not to hyperventilate in the nurse's office because your heart forgot math. I gave it that. I gave it the miscount and the stumble, and the thing that repeated could not repeat it and remain itself. The ring of stones on the ridge, unseen but felt, skinned light off its own edges. Somewhere in the trees, flutes tried to play and made no pitch at all. Only the rush of wind arsing around a hole that had not been placed in the right place on purpose. The deck creaked, and all at once whatever stood outside rethought its geometry. The steps away were not footsteps, but the sound of absence moving, and then there were none. I did not close the hatch. I did not stop breathing wrong. Tears ran sideways along my face into my ear, after a long time. The cold through the woods subsided to something I could have mistaken for cool if I had been a person in a different room, in a different summer. The loose bolt ticked one last time and fell still. When daylight shoved its shoulder under the horizon, I stood and knelt and shut the hatch. My hands shook too much to get the pin through the loop the first 3 tries. On the 4th it slid home with an obedient click that made me laugh in a way that sounded like a cough. I sat on the floor with my back to the closed square and watched light widen on the opposite wall. Outside, the clearing had changed. The spiral marks at the bases of the legs were unmolested. The coin on the bottom stair was gone. The dirt at the foot of the tower held prints that were not elongated, not hands, not hooves, but the flat, ordinary ovals of boots. They stood in a pair for a while, then walked away and did not return. At 9 the radio spoke in Haskins' voice so convincingly that for a moment I believed in men again. Garnet, report. Clear skies, I said, and my mouth. Traitor and friend, added no smoke. There was a pause long enough for me to know he was listening for more. Then, Copy, and the easy crackle of a man who has already reached for his coffee. We'll rotate you out next week, he said, and whatever else he meant by we I chose not to hear. I said, and looked down at the hatch while I said it. I did not leave that day. I did not leave the next. I redrew spirals. I turned every reflective thing to the wall and taped a square of paper over it. I took the bone flute into the clearing and broke it carefully into 3 pieces and buried them at the feet of 3 different trees I could find again without ribbon. I did not go to the ring, and if the mirror on the string had any opinion about the direction it faced now, it would have had to send a letter. The nights were not quiet. Things tried the door in the small hours with the patience of water. Once, something tapped 3 short, 2 long, 3 short on the window, a signal I refused to translate. But no voice spoke my name in the hinge of my breath, and the hatch did not rattle like a jar you shake to see whether what's inside is coins or screws or teeth. The cold stayed in the metal where cold belongs. On the 36th day, Davis came up the trail with a mule. He wore his usual quiet like a coat that fit him. He set the flour down, and the eggs, and the coffee, and he did not look at the hatch. "How you holding up?" he asked, and I heard in the question the part he didn't ask. What did you open? What did you close? What did you feed it? What did it feed you? I said, "Nuff." He nodded, and for a moment something took his face off him and folded it into his hands and put it back on wrong. Or maybe I had a blink too long. He asked, "Ain't he trash?" And I handed him the bag with the broken radio pieces inside. He tied it to the mule without curiosity. He said, "Thursday, collection for the, salvage," and I pretended not to understand. When he turned to go, he didn't say take care. He said, "Keep count." After he left, I opened the logbook and wrote what I wish had been written for me. Not poetry. Not warnings clever enough to be ignored, because cleverness looks like superstition in a uniform. I wrote instructions and called them that. Redraw the spirals every morning before 9 and every night before dusk. If one is cut wrong, don't complete the wrong lines. Clean and recut them right, even if the wood complains. Keep the mirror on the string turned outward, and do not look at it. If anyone on the radio asks for a tin, say you don't have it even if you do. If they ask for you, tell them you are busy and don't apologize. If the hatch breathes with you, breathe wrong. Prime counts work well. The thing that repeats hates mistakes. Don't be perfect. Take shallow breaths when you must, but count them like you mean it. Do not open the door after sunset. Do not answer the tapping with tapping, not even as a joke. If you see a coin with 10 hatch marks, leave it where it lies. If you're going to cry, cry on the north side of the tower, where no one can see you from the ring. I drew the diagram again, the one from 1978 with 10 spirals, and I wrote in the margin where I thought the other 2 had been. On the underside of the floor, not on the legs. I cut them there with the tip of my knife. Shallow and careful, apologizing to the grain while I did it. I wrote the brass words the CCC had stamped, and added the words no one had finished de donaut. Turn your face toward what wants to borrow it. I signed my name, not because I wanted credit, but because someone should know a person had stood here and tried. The summer kept going. Heat pulsed in the afternoons. Storms threatened, and then went to bother other ridges. Twice more the helicopter circled, and both times it flew on. The figures at the edge of the woods kept their distance, interested the way a fox is interested in a henhouse that has learned to latch itself. At night the column of pale, not smoke rose beyond the saddle and hovered, but it did not cross the clearing. When it leaned, the mirror on the string faced it and did not break. On the last Sunday of July, Haskins did rotate me out. Davis came with the mule, and a second man I didn't know, and between them they acted out normal so well that if they had been in a play someone would have written good review copy about their chemistry. I walked down the stairs. I locked the door behind me out of habit, though the habit sat thin on the bone. At the base of the steps I paused and looked at the spirals scratched in the dirt. They looked back the way writing does when you come back to an old notebook and remember your own hand younger. I put the hatchet in my pack and the rope, and I left the pencil on the bottom step for the next caretaker, a small stub etched with the seam of my thumb. "Ready?" Davis asked. I shouldered the pack. The other man took the lead. The trail that had once been lined with figures was only a trail. We walked through it. The forest did not lean in. At the ridge I turned and looked back at the square of glass at the top of the bones. Sun caught the windows and threw me my own light. For a moment the reflection lagged, the way a cheap stream on a bad connection stutters a second behind the man's mouth. Then it matched. I told myself a second is not a story. We kept walking. At the station, Haskins nodded without standing. "Good season so far," he said. Because that's what a man in a chair says when he doesn't want to talk about the smell of pennies on your clothes. He ticked boxes. I signed things. "You'll write up observations," he said. "Keep it clean." I did not ask which kind. I went to the bathroom, looked at my face in a mirror someone had not turned, and counted 3 breaths before it did what mine did. I did not look again. The coffee in the break room tasted like memory. I drank it anyway. I wrote this account because I would have wanted to read it before I took the job. I do not know if truth helps. It is not my experience that truth makes anyone safer. It changes what you're afraid of, that's all. I never saw a wildfire all summer. I learned how a tower sways in wind, and how far sound travels from a ring of stones, and what happens to a man's breath when he lets something else borrow it. I learned that caretaking is not the same as owning, and that locks are theater, and that a mirror, if treated with respect, is a shield you use by pointing it where you won't look. I learned that if a thing asks you to teach it, be careful what part of yourself you offer as curriculum. When I got home, I slept on the floor for a week with a fan at the foot of the mattress, so that the air on my face would feel like wind and not breath. I taped over the mirror in the hallway and left the bathroom mirror turned. I taped a little tab on the tape so I could remove it for guests. But I have not had guests. I keep a pencil in my pocket, and my mouth writes numbers on my breath when I climb stairs. 2, 3, 5, 7, because superstition is just practice that has survived its reason. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I wake convinced I can hear the hatch clicking 2 towns away. It is most likely a pipe in the wall. I lie still and breathe wrong for a while anyway. It is a kind of prayer, or a habit, or an apology. I do not know if the tower on Garnet Peak is safer now than it was when I arrived. The spirals hold. The mirror faces outward. The coin with the 10 hatch marks has not reappeared on the stair. A person whose voice sounded like mine told me on the radio that the weather looked good, and then it did. The next kid who takes that job will pour coffee into the same dented pot and read the same crude notes and decide whether to believe any of it. Maybe she'll think the man who wrote it was lonely and tried to invent company. Maybe she'll hear tapping and tell herself it is the tower cooling after heat. Maybe she'll breathe wrong when the hatch breathe is right, and maybe that will be enough. If she turns the little mirror, I hope she doesn't look. If she hears a voice ask for a tin, I hope she refuses like she was taught to refuse some other thing, some other place, long before she ever climbed those stairs. I do not plan to go back. I know that statement has no weight in the world. The world will call when it wants you. Bargains do not annul themselves because you changed your mind. But for now, there is a tree outside my apartment that throws a ragged shadow on the wall around noon, and when the wind moves through its leaves, the shade breathes in time with mine for 2 counts and then loses me on the 3rd. And that is enough to make soup and do laundry and not put the tape over the mirror for a whole afternoon. I do not go into antique stores because of the mirrors. I do not answer numbers I don't recognize because of the radio. I keep count. I keep breath. I look at nothing that asks too nicely to be looked at. If you read this and take the job anyway, understand this: you are not there to watch for fire. You are there to hold a line that men with their hands in 1936 cut into the world and ask the world to respect. You will not be thanked. You will not be believed. If a thing tells you you are ready, it means it is ready. Tell it no the simplest way you can. Redraw the marks. Breathe wrong. Turn the mirror the right way and keep your eyes on the fly. I think the tower is a lung. I think the ring is a mouth. I think the breath below the hatch is not a monster in the way that word is convenient. I think it is a memory of people who died in the wrong shape and learned to use the shape left. I think it wants to be in our mouths so that it can learn to say what it remembers. I will not help it. I will not be the man who teaches the wrong thing how to talk. I have told the truth as plain as I can. If it comes to your door and turns your handle halfway and holds it there and says your name, say no. It will be patient. Be stubborn. Stubbornness is only patience with a backbone. Count whatever you can count. And if you must open anything, open your mouth long enough to breathe like a bad student until the thing that repeats forgets how to copy you. The last time I dreamed about Garnet Peak, I stood in the clearing at noon and held a cup of coffee and watched my reflection arrive in the window a second late. In the dream, I did not panic. I raised the cup and waited for the glass to catch up, and when it did, I nodded to it like an acquaintance. You could have been a friend within a different life. When I woke, I could not tell if the nod had felt like victory or truce. Maybe those are the same. Maybe that is what caretaking is. Agreeing to live beside a thing without making it your own. I got out of bed and taped the hallway mirror again. And the tape made a small sound like a lid sealing, and I breathed a pattern I would not teach a child and counted in prime numbers, all the way to coffee.